Before we begin, I want to be upfront with my intentions. I make many of my videos in hopes that I can recommend or share something I thought was interesting with other people, hoping maybe they'll give the stuff I love a shot. But in this case, RWBY is too consistently not good for me to wholeheartedly recommend. Sure, I can say the show is probably in an alright place by the time Volume 7 rolls around, but asking someone to sit through several seasons worth to eventually get to an alright show that could possibly drop another bad volume anytime is just something I won't do. In fact, a large part of this analysis will be about what I believe to be the only good subplot in a terrible volume of animation. I can only recommend RWBY if you're someone who likes dissecting media, because this is an interesting show to talk about. It can be a very interesting exercise, but it's also a time-consuming one that can be frustrating. I do not highly recommend RWBY, and what good analysis I give is not indicative of the entire show. If you're more interested in tackling RWBY from a more critical angle, here's a couple cool videos made by cool people doing just that. But if you've already seen RWBY, then I hope my interpretation can deepen your appreciation of the show. Because as a kid watching older volumes weekly, there was a lot of bad faith criticism and ridiculous takes floating around. And for the amount of attention this show has gotten, there was a dearth of compelling analysis on both positive and critical sides. So now that I'm a big YouTube boy, I thought I'd pay the show forward because watching it and dissecting it probably helped develop my media literacy a considerable amount. I have to recognize this show was making a lot of mistakes, but I couldn't identify with a lot of the criticisms I was seeing. Thanks to my time in the RWBY community trying to understand the good or understandable criticisms while distinguishing it from the dog shit, all the while trying to unravel my own findings, became second nature to me. There are definitely things to criticize RWBY for, and again, I'll link a couple of great criticism videos in the description, but I'm gonna be a positive, wholesome boy today, so here we go. Here are the RWBY characters and subplots that I do find unironically compelling. To start, we will be talking about two characters with obvious parallels. Yang and Cinder both explore the appeal of power and control next to the cold reality that you will always be vulnerable no matter how much power or control you have. To Cinder, power is a crux, and so she's always desperate to grab more, whether in the form of the Maiden's power or a crude replacement for her lost arm. Her Grim Arm becoming a permanent vulnerability that her aura can't protect is a good metaphor for her character as a whole. In ignoring her weaknesses and vulnerabilities, she ends up making more for herself. Cinder is always spiteful to people who have more power than her. That's why she both idolizes and fears Salem. No one is more powerful than Salem, and so Cinder ends up imitating her, not only adding more black to her design as the series goes on and in using Salem's methods to divide others, but in becoming more monstrous and untrusting for the sake of power. But because she can never hope to match Salem, at least not anytime soon, Cinder is never comfortable around her. Because if Cinder isn't the most powerful person in the room, she lacks the control she craves. This is reflected in how she describes having half of Fall's power.
Yes, it's an emptiness. It burns, like hunger. I like it.
Her Cinderella backstory is almost disappointingly predictable, but that origin is the perfect start for her character. She can't stand the thought of becoming a sad, powerless girl again, one who is not the controller but the controlled. When John, one of the weakest characters in the cast, lands a lucky hit on Cinder, it sends her into a fit. Cinder was so shaken by her defeat at Beacon that her confidence became fragile. She has trouble accepting her human vulnerability and as a result lacks the tools to cope with and live with them. This even applies to her changing character design. Her signature short dress and long hair replaced by a far less revealing dress with a long baggy sleeve to cover her fake arm, and bangs to cover the scars left by RWBY. She's making active attempts to hide her wounds. And standing in direct contrast to her is Yang Xiaolong. Similar to Cinder, Yang is a character who started Volume 1 brimming with confidence and power. Her semblance was so good she could always depend on it to get her out of a bind, until she ran into an opponent who couldn't care less about how powerful she thought she was. With just a single attack, Yang's world comes crashing down, not just because she's physically lost a part of herself, but because she has been made painfully vulnerable in that instant. This wasn't the first time Yang lost a fight, but she always had some degree of control or a chance to fight back. But here her best efforts could be brushed off and she stood to lose more than just the fight itself. She lost her arm and nearly failed to protect her friend. Similarly, just an episode apart, Cinder was made powerless in the face of an opponent who could shut her down in an instant. Both characters lost control and as a result lost a piece of themselves. And they both spend the next volume trying to recover. The crucial difference being made by the company they kept. Salem knew exactly how to deal with Cinder's condition. Use that pain and self-loathing as fuel to find more power. Grab it in any way you can, so you can be sure that no one can make you vulnerable again. To both characters, power is a means for security, For Cinder, it's a tool to overcome her would-be suppressors, and for Yang, her power made her a reliable guardian to her sister and eventually her whole team. Yang's father Tai couldn't give Yang a huge boost in power, but he could offer sound advice. He still encourages Yang to find new strength, both through training and replacing what she lost, but instead of telling her to become the most powerful and most dominant fighter possible, he reminds Yang that she may never be as strong as she wants to be. That her semblance, while amazing, can be misused, wasted, or even outright ineffective. Any ability that requires you to take damage is inherently risky, but that never stopped Yang from abusing it. But now she knows there's no guarantee her Super Saiyan transformation will make her stronger than the opponent, and especially becomes clear when the maidens and other magic users are introduced. Tai tells Yang to accept that she wasn't as strong as she thought she was, and she may never be as strong as she wants to be. But because that is the case, she has to work within her limitations. He even tells her that she doesn't necessarily have to fight through her problems. There could be a solution that doesn't involve asserting power control at all. By far the best scenes to illustrate this dichotomy is Cinder's fight with Raven, when she tries to brute force through an opponent who's evenly matched with her, and the following scene where Yang lets go of her prosthetic arm so that she can run past Mercury and come face to face with her mother, who is far more powerful than her whether or not she has her new arm. Yang was ready to give up power, her crux, in order to get a chance to talk things out, to find a way around the problem. That's an action Cinder would never take. Cinder is too paranoid, too greedy, too afraid to give up even a bit of leverage. All attempts she ever made at negotiations was simply to display her power and say, if you can't beat me, join me. Which is probably another element she picked up from Salem. The scene of Yang and Raven also continues to illustrate Yang as a protector. When Yang first meets her mother Raven, she scoffs at her request saying family only comes around when they need you. But here Yang is not only willing to personally forgive Raven for her weakness and for giving up the fight against Salem, but takes responsibility for it. The most tactical solution would have been to have Raven seal the vault again with the relic still inside. But that solution would still leave a target on Raven's back, so Yang takes the relic out, freeing her mother from the conflict for good, because she's a family girl, she's a protector. Power for its own sake is meaningless, and power for oneself is cowardice. And that's why simply having power doesn't make you strong, as Yang puts it. You have to use what power you have in an efficient way for a worthwhile cause. Which brings us to Yang's second encounter with Adam Taurus, because I actually like her half of this fight. Just ignore all the dumb baggage Adam has with the Malcolm X analogy turned comedically evil ex-boyfriend, just for a minute please.
What does she even see in you?
Adam's semblance allows him to absorb damage without having to feel the pain like Yang would. But because Yang has felt the pain before, she's wary to avoid it. While Adam lets his anger control him during the fight and he ends up wasting his semblance, Yang fought defensively, controlled her anger, and saved it for the right moment. It's a rare case of the show using contrasting semblances in a clever way to illustrate a fight's themes. Again, it's brought down by the aforementioned baggage with the whole racism subplot, but please, we're being positive today. To put it plainly, Cinder is desperate for control over others so that she can feel secure, and in that pursuit of power loses more and more of herself in a reckless gambit, all while pushing others out. While Yang acknowledges her limits and as a result slowly learns to live with them. She doesn't lose herself, she simply becomes a new self. More cautious but still just as determined to fight for the causes and people she believes in. Gaining over trauma isn't about returning to normal, it's about learning to live with what happened to you and how it changed you, while acknowledging that something that terrible could still happen again. As much as we may not want to admit it, the human body and soul are fragile things. You can try and make it indestructible or immovable, but you will fail because failure and pain is a part of being human. Sometimes it's better to bend, move, or change your mind before you break. Chasing control in all things is just asking for a sea of paranoia to wash over you. If you want to live with the reality that you are a person and therefore can be damaged or hurt, be prepared to take a sober look at where you stand and then ask yourself, what can I achieve with what I have right here with me today? What is it I can't achieve? What is it I shouldn't achieve? If your answers don't satisfy you, then you might be selling yourself short. Another man has probably asked himself these questions. One who, like Yang, labors to carry the burdens of others' safety, while, like Cinder, continues chasing control. James Ironwood is the closest thing to a full-on cyborg within the show. He's lost so much of himself. But in all likelihood, these losses were willing sacrifices. As a military general, Ironwood is always seeking power and control. It's his job to keep the people safe. But how can he do that if his army is still pitiful next to Salem's? But unlike Cinder, James has a better understanding of his weaknesses. So much so that it scares him. He knows what he can and can't accomplish, which is why sacrifice is his solution. There is truth in the mindset that sacrifice is good for strategy. In a game of chess, sacrificing a pawn or a rook is acceptable as long as the king or the end goal remains untouched. The ends justify the means. Losing a limb is something that warrants periods of healing for most characters, most notably Yang and Cinder. But it's a sacrifice that Ironwood can make in a hot second, and because of his position, he often asks other people to make similar sacrifices. Ironwood's decision to abandon Mantle, followed by his threat to bomb it in order to control Penny, is terrible and ruthless. He's playing a numbers game with human lives. Sometimes risks don't pay off, and if Team RWBY cooperated with Ironwood, it's not hard to imagine they would have saved half the population, while simultaneously getting the relic out of Sim's reach, in addition to bringing global communications back to Remnant. That would be a huge tactical advantage in the fight against Salem. This outcome is far from the worst one given the dire circumstances. Let's not forget it comes with a sacrifice, but Ironwood is doing this in hopes that it will sacrifice less in the long run. Of course, Team RWBY is ready to take the risk and fight for every life. After all, Mantle was always the one to suffer, and Ironwood is asking them to accept termination, which is a really bad look for Ironwood. After all, whether he's aware of it or not, his plan is to sacrifice the poor and unfortunate for the rich and powerful. Now, it's not that Ironwood believes the people's lives in Mantle to be worth less than those in Atlas. I don't think he's that kind of person. In fact, he seems to be at odds with the bigwig bourgeoisie class. But the obvious class structure inherent to the kingdom's design is making this course of action the path of least resistance for his plan. Had he taken more measures to create equality or push back against the exploitative lizardmen like Jacques, maybe he wouldn't have to choose between the two cities to begin with. I think it's a very interesting conflict of interests. Ironwood is a compelling character because he's caught between a rock and a hard place. Fearful not just of Salem, but what she can do to the people of Remnant. What she will do if no one stops her. Like Atlas himself, he feels the weight of the world on his shoulders and it's crushing him, and pushing him over the brink. Too afraid to lose it all, he goes for the safer option, and arguably the most responsible decision given the stakes. But RWBY is a very optimistic show, all things considered. In spite of all the angst and edge. In fact, that edge is there to test the optimism of the characters. Which is why I'm fine with Ironwood being portrayed as wrong, or even villainous. I think many fans of many media often assume that the character with the most ruthless utilitarian solution is the right one. The one that did nothing wrong, as it were. In many ways, James Ironwood is right, but it's not that simple. Because ruthless strategies like Ironwood should be scrutinized. They should be challenged and attacked, because if their logic is faulty or they underestimate the capabilities of themselves or the people around them, their solution might not be all that good. The veneer of efficiency can become a set of blinders. Pessimists can lob retorts like you're not being realistic or you're not willing to do what it takes, even though they can be just as quick to assume they're in the right as the so-called dreamers. Team RWBY abandons the city of Atlas to save its people, an option Ironwood overlooked because of his army's imperialistic pride in Atlas. To them, abandoning the city was out of the question, they never considered it. There's a lot of Atlas exceptionalism in these recent volumes, and it shows. Another bias in Ironwood's thinking is how he failed to account for the illogical or emotional acts of both his allies and enemies. The fight against the Aesops is the best scene to illustrate this. All four of them following his orders, but they have conflicting feelings about those orders. Mero can't fight to the best of his ability because he's a bleeding heart. Vine and Elm interpret the orders differently, and Harriet is a total zealot. They aren't unified at all. And I love how the vocals in the music reflects this theme. War has four singers finishing each other's sentences in a 4-on-4 fight. One team unified in their goal and the other one being riddled with doubts and disagreements. I'd love to talk more about this fight because I love it so much, but I'm already on a tangent, so back to Ironwood. The extreme authoritarian structure James has made incentivizes individuals to think of themselves as a disposable cog in a machine. He believes human emotion is where our greatest weaknesses lie, and he tries to suppress his own alongside his comrades. Characters like Penny are even rewarded for rebelling against his orders. She literally becomes human by rejecting his emotionless logic. Suppressing emotions would have obvious benefits. Emotions can be weakness, and things could be easier if we were all tin men. But it simply can't be done as long as you're human. Even James lets his anger and ego guide him throughout his mission. The show instead suggests we should master our emotions. Find out how we can best use our anger, pride, envy, empathy, grief, fear, and of course, love. You can't live without them, so learn to live with them.
I hate this game of emotions we play. These strong wives will make it through this together. Shut
If everyone just accepted Ironwood's way without question, there would be no room to grow and more sacrifices around every hurdle. The character of Ironwood is a cautionary tale of a good man with good intentions turning a blind eye towards his biases, while letting his pessimism take hold in his country's darkest hour. Optimism versus pessimism is an age-old theme in media for a reason, and even though I can point to a couple other works that tackle the same topic better, I honestly think RWBY did this theme justice, and remarkably well, considering where the show came from. So yeah, that's I said nice things about RWBY today. Now, if you want to hear me say not so nice things, I made a huge tier list with a friend of mine, and it's 2 hours long. We get into way a lot of detail of so many more characters, both positive and negative. I think it's really exciting. Go check out my side channel, Evil Puff. Thank you all so much for watching. Like and sub if you want to see more, and I'll see ya in the next one.